Well, good morning. Thanks for joining us. Enforcing laws and keeping the community safe is a team effort, and one of the key players on that team is the county prosecuting attorney. We'll explore that subject this morning with Matthew Wiese, Marquette County Prosecutor. It starts right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Now, here's your host, Don Ryan.
The view of what a prosecuting attorney does is often shaped by what we see in the movies, where the prosecutor is either the good guy or the bad guy, depending on the story, carrying out his assignment in the courtroom. But in fact, prosecutors have much broader responsibilities and play a key role in all aspects of law enforcement in their counties. Our guest this morning is very qualified to talk about that subject. He serves in the largest prosecuting attorney's office north of Grand Rapids. He has over 20 years of prosecution experience and served as the chief assistant prosecuting attorney before being appointed to complete the term of former prosecutor Gary Walker. He was reelected in 2012 and is currently unopposed for reelection. Matt Wiese, welcome to the Ryan Report.
Thank you, Don.
Good to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we get down to serious business, maybe a little background, people get to know you better. You grew up downstate, didn't you?
Right. I grew up in the Thumb area in a farming community.
Okay.
And I came to Northern Michigan University to go to college because I loved the Upper Peninsula, always did. I used to come up here as a young man, as a teenager, camping, hunting, fishing. And so I knew I wanted to live up here from the time I was a teenager.
And looking at your bio, when you first came to Northern, you weren't certain in what direction your career would go, is that right?
Well, I knew that I wanted to pursue a pre-law program and go to law school, but I didn't know what type of law I wanted to practice.
Okay.
I was interested in environmental law, of all things, and I discovered that that was not quite the niche for me.
Okay. And you wound up going to Vermont.
Right. I went to Vermont Law School because it's a highly rated environmental law school, their program is. And I pretty soon realized once I was there that I really liked the courtroom experience, the handling of cases, that type of thing. So in environmental law, although there's a lot of good things about it, it's also pretty code-based and pretty regulatory and slow. And in my opinion, for me, it would have been more of a not as challenging.
Okay. Yet with your law degree, you wound up on the staff at Northern Michigan University for a time.
Right. I worked as a prosecutor, as an assistant prosecutor for 10 years, and then I left that to do work with a national nonprofit, the Battered Women's Justice Project, where I worked with grantees from the Department of Justice. I worked half-time with the U.S. Marine Corps. That was for 2 years, and that was it was a lot of travel involved with that. And having a family and living in Marquette, I had an opportunity to go to Northern to work as their judicial affairs officer dealing with student misconduct issues as the associate dean of students.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then eventually you wound up in the Marquette County Prosecutor's Office as the chief assistant prosecutor.
Correct. So from 1999 to 2000, or 1997 to 2002, I left the office and I had those two separate jobs.
Okay.
And I left because it was an increase in pay and different opportunities. But I realized after about 5 years that what I really missed was being a prosecutor. And fortunately, Gary Walker hired me back into the office in 2002, and I've been there ever since.
And you've not only been a prosecutor, you've written extensively. Many of your books and publications have been used across the state.
Yes, I was involved with the Model Domestic Violence Policy for Marquette County, involved with developing a personal protection order manual for the State Bar of Michigan. Wrote some articles for the State Bar Journal, a State Bar publication, its monthly magazine, on issues of domestic violence.
Before we get down to the serious legal business, what do you do for fun?
Oh, for fun? Well, I like to go to camp. I like to fly fish, read, cross-country ski, hike, mountain bike. Picked a lot of wild berries the last month.
Okay, good season.
Great season for the wild raspberries and for the blackberries.
Okay, let's talk about what happens in a prosecutor's office. First of all, you're involved with more than just prosecuting certain criminal cases.
Right.
What is your office? What's the broad range of activities you're involved with?
Okay. Well, our office handles everything that law enforcement deals with in Marquette County. So that could be anything from a trespasser to a stray dog, to a drunk driver, to a homicide, sexual assault case. We also deal with issues involving families where there's allegations of abuse or neglect in a family and children need to be protected. We deal with children, people under 17 who commit offenses, crimes, or other types of offenses where they don't go to school, they're truant, or they're runaways, or they are incorrigible to their parents. We also serve a function giving advice to law enforcement on changes in the law. It's our job, I believe, to give advice and direction to law enforcement on recent legal changes. So it's quite a wide range of things that we do, and everything that comes in doesn't always get charged. So, but everything that the law enforcement deals with, we take a second look at and determine should something happen or not happen with what they've investigated.
And I want to follow up on several of those points, but first of all, you mentioned law enforcement. Is it a team effort between your office and the law enforcement, or is there any adversarial relationship there at all? Or?
We have an excellent working relationship with law enforcement, with the police. The prosecutor is actually considered part of law enforcement,
right.
And by Michigan law, we're the chief law enforcement official for the jurisdiction. So it can sometimes be a little strained if the police see something one way and we see something another way, or if we have to tell the police that we think there was a violation of law or constitution in how something happened. But it's our job to be the first kind of gatekeeper in the system to say, this isn't right how this was handled. So contrary to what a lot of people may think, the prosecutor's first and foremost job is to make sure that we follow the law, that we abide by the Constitution, and make sure that people's rights are protected.
Okay. Follow up on that in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take this break. The guest this morning is Marquette County Prosecuting Attorney Matt Wiese, talking before the break about how decisions are made in the prosecutor's office. You know, people hear about plea deals, for example. What goes into that kind of decision making?
Well, when it comes to a plea deal or a plea agreement or a plea bargain, you know, the thing that I hear the most from people that don't work in the criminal justice system is they don't want to see people get the proverbial slap on the wrist. And that means a lot to a lot of different people. What goes into plea agreements is basically this. We have a policy, say, when it comes to drunk driving. If it's certain things happen, like there was an accident, somebody got hurt, the blood alcohol content was above a certain level, if the person's underage and shouldn't be drinking in the first place, we have certain rules that we've applied as a policy so there's consistency. When it comes to domestic violence cases, the same type of thing. If there's a history, if there were injuries, you know, that type of thing. And of course, victim input is huge when it comes to plea agreements, because if it's a victim case where somebody was harmed or lost property or lost money, we have to make sure that we speak to the victim or give them an opportunity to speak to us to give us their input as to what they would like to see done on a case. So there's that, and then when it comes to felonies, there's things like sentencing guidelines that come into play that will either call for probation, jail, or prison, and we factor that into it. Then we have to weigh that against the strength of our case. Do we have enough evidence? You know, if we know the person did the crime, but can we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? And if we can't, do we then consider perhaps making an agreement for testimony with a co-defendant or another player? So there's a whole milieu of
factors
things
that
come into it.
You know, we also hear, and I'm not going to refer to any specific cases, but you know, occasionally we hear of, even in a case of murder, where we know who did it, but nothing is ever done, maybe for years. And this is a case where there's not evidence, is that right?
Right. And we have actually a couple of cold case homicides that we're looking into again that happened in Marquette County. The Prosecutors Association of Michigan has taken this as an initiative because Michigan is like 49th or 50th in the nation with unsolved homicide cases on the books. And we're looking at a couple of our cases to present to the cold case task force to see if there's another, you know, something we missed, if there's some evidence that could be found or another angle to pursue to try to solve those cases. Because, you know, as was recently in the news with the young man from Minnesota, they finally found out in the Wetterling case, you know, that affects families and communities for years and years.
Yeah. I know one of the, and certainly it's a very serious issue, but domestic violence, sexual assault, but it's an area you've become very passionate about. Talk to us about
That kind of goes back to my law school days, where I had a pretty strong influence from a woman law professor who worked with domestic violence victims. And growing up not knowing about that, not understanding those issues, I'd never seen it or been exposed to it. It was really eye-opening for me to see how really prevalent that type of thing could be. And then also with sexual abuse of children, you know, never having known of that, seeing how that could be prevalent in a society. So for me it was very eye-opening, and I felt that as a prosecutor, that's where you could really advocate for somebody and try to find some justice, safety in a home. We know that if domestic violence, if there's not an intervention, that eventually, if it goes out of control, it often will lead to homicide. We know that the #1 perpetrator of homicide against a woman in our country is by an intimate partner. So with those types of numbers, it's important that we address that type of crime, you know, very aggressively and make sure that there are consequences.
And it's not just prosecuting criminals here, is it? It's helping women to understand their rights?
Right, helping a woman who maybe didn't think the system cared, who maybe thought the police wouldn't do anything, who maybe thought that nothing would happen if the case got reported. So it's all about victim safety, #1, and #2, offender accountability, and #3, trying to reduce the incidence of domestic violence.
And in the area of sexual assault, are we making progress there?
I think we are. We've seen an uptick in the number of cases that we've been getting. And so when I look at the statistics, I'm always a little bit concerned what's going on. And I think the #1 thing to remember is that the majority of our sexual assault cases are not a stranger who's lurking in the shadows. It's a known person, either a relative, a friend, a family friend, or quite often probably half of my cases involve children who are being abused by either family members sexually or people who have access to those families. So I think it's important for us to know, you know, that we have a safe community, and that sexual assault typically is going to happen when there's some sort of a relationship. And when it comes to children and the increase in stats and the numbers we've seen, I think it's not so much that we have an increase in this type of crime, but we have an increase in awareness, that people know if I report that this happened, something will be done about it. It'll be looked into. It won't just be, you know, that secret that never got addressed, that dirty secret that, you know, the society doesn't address. And the more there's awareness, I think the more likelihood that we're going to see more cases come out, because people have more confidence that there's going to be an appropriate response.
Okay. Follow up on some other issues in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after this break. Again, this morning our guest is Matt Wiese, Marquette County Prosecuting Attorney. I guess we touched on the probate and juvenile issues, but is there more we should talk about in that area? Or do we have problems in Marquette County? Obviously we have some. Is it a serious problem?
With our juvenile cases, it's not as serious. You know, kids get into trouble. I mean, those of us that have kids and those of us growing up, we know that type of thing can happen. The thing is to address it appropriately, to make sure that the parents understand their roles, to offer education to the kids, to offer education to the parents if they maybe don't have appropriate parenting techniques. The big thing is with, you know, we've had a problem with drugs in the community, and just to be aware that with the prevalence of prescription drugs these days, that to be mindful of those prescriptions, because that's where we see a lot of abuse happening with underage individuals. You know,
Okay.
They can get access to these prescriptions, and people don't keep track of them. So that's a big caution that I have, is that people need to be cognizant of their prescription drugs, to safeguard them, to keep them, you know, secured, locked if they need to, because that's where we see a lot of the substance abuse beginning with underage individuals.
Is drug abuse the biggest crime problem in Marquette County?
Yes, absolutely. It's estimated around the state, and I concur with this with my colleagues around the state, that more than half of our crimes are related to drugs. Whether it's stealing to get the drugs, stealing to get the money to get the drugs, stealing to get the items to make the drugs, it's half or more would be my estimate. And I think that with the prevalence of prescriptions in our society, I read a report not too long ago where it says that in Michigan, the average person has 11 prescriptions. And you know, that's 10 or 11 million people in Michigan, and that's a lot of prescription drugs out there. And it makes me wonder, because I don't have any right now, so that's 11 that's someone else,
Yeah.
you know. So just to be aware that prescription drugs are a problem, that they're pushed a lot, you know, with advertisements and whatnot, but to keep them in the right hands and so they don't get in the wrong hands.
How do we get around this problem? Are we making any progress, or is it getting worse?
Well, I think we're making progress. We have a number of treatment courts in Marquette County. We have a sobriety court for habitual drunk drivers, and we have a drug treatment court for people who are addicted to drugs. So the first go-around, or even the second or third go-around, if nobody was hurt, if nobody was a crime victim, if the person is not a violent person, we always give the person who has an addiction problem a shot at redemption. In other words, go to a program, go to treatment, stay clean and sober, prove that you can be clean and sober and not a danger to yourself or the community. So we always give people that opportunity. The problem is that that is such a hard thing for so many people to finally get firmly rooted into recovery. And we know from dealing with these cases, and I'm not by any means a professional in this area, but it takes sometimes 6, 7, 8 times before a person finally realizes that, yes, I have to embrace this concept so that I can live a clean and sober life.
It's certainly a tough problem.
Yeah.
A couple of other things I did want to touch on before we wrap it up today. I know there are rights for victims,
Right.
and I think that's an important subject.
Absolutely. I started long enough ago where we didn't have crime victims' rights, and now it's part of our law and part of our Constitution. And the basic principle is that if you are a crime victim, you have a right to have input into the process, you have a right to speak to the prosecutor about your case, and the prosecutor has an obligation to keep you informed about the progress of the case, what's going to happen, what to expect, how things are going to go.
So how do they initiate that? Is it the victim's responsibility?
We initiate contact with every crime victim, first with a letter on more serious crimes, any type of serious domestic violence, sexual assault. We initiate the contact
Okay.
right away. With domestic violence cases, our goal is to reach out to a victim within 24 to 48 hours so that we can let him or her know what's going on with the case, to talk to them about the case. The sooner we give them information, the more likelihood that we're going to have a successful outcome in the case.
There's a bill being considered in Lansing. In fact, it's been approved by the House.
Right.
That's called presumptive parole, which would really affect how prisoners are affected by the parole system. Attorney General Schuette has said he's very strongly against this measure. How do you feel about it?
Absolutely, I agree with the Attorney General on this one. The Prosecutors Association of Michigan agrees also. Presumptive parole is a bad idea. I understand that the Michigan Department of Corrections has a huge budget. I think it's the largest budget of any department in the state. And the Prosecutors Association, we've looked at the corrections issue and why it costs so much to keep an inmate incarcerated. But here's what I know. I know that historically, before we had truth in sentencing, I would sit down with a crime victim and we would kind of guesstimate. Well, if we get 10 years, they could get out in 6. You know, if they get 12 years, they could get out in 8. It was a guessing game. When we passed a law called truth in sentencing means that if the judge sentences somebody to 5 years on the minimum, they're going to do 5 years before they can be eligible for parole. If they get 10 years, we know they're going to get 10 years before they can become eligible for parole. With presumptive parole, it goes back to the guessing game because you don't ever know when they're going to be released. So when I'm talking to a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old sexual assault victim and I say he's going to get 10 years, they know that they're going to be 23 or 24 before he ever gets out, and that can give them such good closure to the case to know that I'm going to be that old before that person can get out, and I know I'm going to be old enough to protect myself.
Okay.
Presumptive parole
Not a good thing.
Not a good thing.
We're out of time.
Yeah,
Thanks very
sorry.
much for coming in this
You're
morning,
welcome.
Matt. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Don.
I'll be back with some other thoughts for you on the Ryan Report after we take this break. Well, ponder is a word we don't hear too often these days. It means to think about something carefully before reaching a conclusion, to contemplate, reflect on, or to deliberate about. Something I've been known to be is a ponderer, although it often doesn't relate to things that are really deserving of thoughtful consideration, as regular viewers of this show can attest. For example, occasionally I feel something and wonder, who decided to start doing this? How did this practice begin? Case in point, have you ever been out walking and noticed the phrase, "Do not spit on the sidewalk," stenciled into the concrete? When that concrete was poured, it was put there as a permanent reminder to all who walked on that path. It's a practice that started years ago. I don't think they do it anymore, but it does make me wonder why they felt it was necessary in the first place. At some point in time, was there a major issue with people spitting on the sidewalk? Before we had concrete walks, were people always spitting on the gravel path? And was this an attempt to break them of that habit? Yet irate citizens come to town hall meetings to pound on the table and demand that something be done about the problem of people spitting on the sidewalk. It's not that I don't support what they're saying. I agree we don't need people spitting all over our sidewalks. But with all the issues the city fathers were dealing with back in those days, it just seems unusual that this problem would be singled out for special attention by engraving a permanent warning in the concrete. But you know, the truth is, I kind of like the idea and think we should take it to the next level. I think our sidewalks could become a real message center, a way to inform or teach people. As new concrete sidewalks are rolled out, we could incorporate a lot of different messages. For example, suppose you're out walking, look down and see the message, "Don't slouch, it's bad for your posture." Now that would be a healthy reminder to all of us. Or how about, keep your head up and your eyes ahead to watch out for other walkers. Lengthy, but a good safety warning. Another good one would be, no texting while walking. It's not as dangerous as doing it in a car, but people have been known to get into serious accidents while walking with their heads looking down at their cell phone. Perhaps we could also use our sidewalks for advertising. Maybe we could get a bank or an auto company to pay for the cost of a sidewalk, just to get their name engraved on it. They pay to get their name on sports stadiums like Comerica Park and Ford Field. Why not sidewalks? As you can see, pondering can take you off in strange directions. I think I'll leave this subject for now while I ponder about why the Lone Ranger used silver bullets. Wasn't that a wasteful and unnecessary expense? I'll be back in 2 minutes. Thanks to Matt Weesey for joining us this morning, talking about what goes on in the prosecutor's offices. They have a big job, and we appreciate getting some insights into that activity. Today's show is coming up next. Thanks for joining us. Hope we can see you again next Sunday morning.